Close your eyes for a moment and picture a Viking. Chances are the image that comes to mind looks something like this. A tall, powerfully built warrior, pale skin, flowing blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, standing at the prow of a longship as it cuts through icy northern waters. This image has been repeated so often across so many films, television series, and history books that it feels less like a stereotype and more like an established fact. A single, unified people, purely Scandinavian in blood, spreading outward from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark to raid and conquer across Europe. In 2020, the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted on Viking Age remains was published in the scientific journal Nature, and it quietly, systematically dismantled almost every piece of that popular image. The genetic evidence researchers uncovered did not simply add small details to the existing story. It fundamentally rewrote our understanding of who the Vikings actually were, where they truly came from, and what being a Viking genuinely meant in the first place. Let's start with understanding exactly how significant this particular study really was, because the scale of the research matters enormously here. An international team of geneticists and archaeologists sequenced the genomes of more than 400 individuals, recovered from Viking Age burial sites scattered across an enormous geographic range, stretching from Greenland in the far northwest, through Scandinavia itself, and all the way to sites in Russia, the British Isles, and even parts of southern Europe. Never before had researchers assembled a genetic data set of this size, or this geographic breadth, connected to the Viking Age. What they found inside that data challenged decades of assumptions, almost immediately. The very first major finding directly contradicted the idea of Vikings as one single, genetically unified people. Instead, genetic analysis revealed that Scandinavia itself, even before the Viking Age, technically began around the late 8th century, was already home to a surprisingly diverse and genetically varied population. Long before Viking ships ever set sail toward foreign shores, people living across Denmark, Norway, and Sweden already carried genetic ancestry connected to southern Europe and to populations further east. Evidence of centuries of earlier migration, trade, and intermixing that predated the Viking Age by a considerable margin. In other words, the very foundation of the popular Viking image, a genetically pure and isolated Scandinavian population, was already inaccurate before a single longship had ever been built. But the discoveries did not stop there. Perhaps the single most remarkable finding to emerge from this entire body of research involved what happened outside Scandinavia itself, at Viking burial sites scattered across the British Isles. Researchers examined the remains of 2 individuals recovered from a burial site in the Orkney Islands, off the northern coast of Scotland. Both individuals had been buried with genuine Viking swords and other authentic Viking-style grave goods, exactly the kind of burial archaeologists have long associated with people of Scandinavian identity. And yet, when researchers sequenced their DNA, the genetic results showed something nobody had anticipated. These 2 individuals were not genetically Scandinavian at all. Their DNA closely matched local populations from Scotland and Ireland. Think carefully about what that actually means. These were not simply distant descendants of intermarriage, carrying small traces of local ancestry mixed with Scandinavian blood. These appear to have been local British or Irish individuals who fully adopted Viking cultural identity, Viking weaponry, and Viking burial customs, despite carrying no significant Scandinavian ancestry whatsoever. For archaeologists and historians alike, this discovery landed as a genuine turning point in how researchers understand what being a Viking actually meant. It suggests, quite powerfully, that Viking identity during this period functioned far more as a shared culture, a shared set of practices, alliances, and beliefs, than as any kind of fixed ethnic or genetic category. This finding connects directly to something historians studying Old Norse language and literature had actually suspected for quite some time, even before this genetic evidence emerged. The word Viking itself, in its original Old Norse usage, did not originally refer to a specific ethnic group or nationality at all. It referred instead to an activity, essentially meaning to go raiding or to go on an overseas expedition. Under this original meaning, someone quite literally went Viking, the same way a person today might go fishing or go traveling. It described what a person did, temporarily and often seasonally, rather than who that person fundamentally was by birth or bloodline. Genetic evidence from sites like Orkney now provides direct physical confirmation of exactly this understanding. Vikings were not a single people. They were a shifting, culturally defined group that people from many different backgrounds could join, adopt, and participate within. If you find it fascinating how genetic evidence can quietly confirm centuries-old linguistic theories like this one, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep bringing you carefully researched deep dives exactly like this one. Now, let's turn to another major discovery from the same research, because it reveals something genuinely important about how differently various Viking groups actually operated, depending on exactly where in Scandinavia they originally came from. Popular culture often treats Vikings as a single, unified force, but the genetic evidence tells a considerably more nuanced story, one that closely matches distinct regional patterns already suggested by historical records and archaeological trade goods. Genetic data recovered from Viking Age burial sites in England showed particularly strong ancestral connections to what is now Denmark, aligning closely with well-documented historical records describing repeated Danish Viking raids and eventual settlement across large portions of eastern and northern England throughout the 9th and 10th centuries. Meanwhile, genetic evidence recovered from sites across the North Atlantic, including Iceland, and the more scattered, ultimately unsuccessful Viking settlements in Greenland showed considerably stronger genetic ties to Norway, once again matching well-established historical accounts describing Norwegian expansion westward across the open North Atlantic. Perhaps the most genuinely fascinating regional pattern, however, involves genetic evidence connecting Viking Age Sweden to territories much further east than most popular depictions of the Viking world typically acknowledge. Historical sources have long described a distinct group known as the Russ, Swedish Vikings, who traveled eastward along major river systems through what is now Russia and Ukraine, eventually establishing trade networks and political influence stretching as far as Byzantium, the great Eastern Roman capital centered in Constantinople. Genetic evidence recovered from burial sites across this eastern region supports this exact historical narrative, showing clear ancestral connections between these eastern settlements and Viking Age Sweden specifically, distinct from the Danish and Norwegian genetic signatures found further west. This regional genetic distinctiveness matters enormously for understanding the Viking Age accurately. Rather than a single unified Scandinavian people spreading outward uniformly in every direction, the genetic evidence reveals something considerably more accurate to how trade, exploration, and settlement patterns generally tend to actually work throughout human history. Different communities, starting from different specific regions, follow different established routes, driven by existing trade relationships, geographic proximity, and prior contact, rather than following any single uniform pattern of expansion. Beyond these broader regional patterns, researchers also identified individual cases that add genuinely striking detail to this picture. At a burial site in Britain dating to the Viking Age, genetic analysis of one individual revealed ancestry connected to sub-Saharan Africa, a finding that surprised many researchers working on the project, given how far this specific ancestry lies from any of the trade or migration routes most commonly associated with the Viking world. Rather than dismissing this as some kind of anomaly or error, researchers have suggested it likely reflects the enormous reach of Viking Age trade and slave networks, which extended, through a long chain of intermediary contacts, considerably further than most popular accounts of the period typically acknowledge. Viking traders are well documented historically as having participated actively in extensive slave trading networks, moving captured individuals across enormous distances, sometimes spanning multiple intermediary trading partners across several different regions and cultures before reaching their final destination. Other individual genomes examined through the same research showed traces of ancestry connected to southern Europe, and in at least one case, ancestry markers consistent with more distant Asian populations, further reinforcing just how extensively interconnected long-distance trade networks across medieval Eurasia genuinely were, even during a period many of us tend to imagine as considerably more isolated and disconnected than it actually was. None of this diversity was the exception within Viking Age society. Taken together with the broader regional genetic patterns already discussed, it increasingly appears to have simply been the ordinary, unremarkable reality of daily life within many Viking Age communities. It's also worth briefly examining how this genetic diversity came to exist within Scandinavia in the first place, since the roots of this diversity actually stretch back considerably further than the Viking Age itself. Thousands of years before Viking ships ever set sail, Scandinavia experienced repeated waves of earlier migration, including farming populations, who gradually moved northward out of the Middle East and southern Europe, bringing agriculture with them, and later, herding populations who migrated westward out of the Eurasian steppe, bringing new languages and new genetic ancestry along with them. These much older migrations had already thoroughly reshaped the genetic makeup of Scandinavia long before the Viking Age technically began. In other words, the genetic diversity researchers found within Viking Age burial sites was not some sudden, unusual development unique to the Viking period itself. It was simply the latest chapter within a much longer, considerably older pattern of migration and genetic mixing that had already been unfolding across northern Europe for thousands of years beforehand. There is another important layer to this story worth examining carefully, because it touches on something considerably more sensitive than simple questions of ancient genetic ancestry. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the popular image of the tall, blonde, blue-eyed Viking warrior became closely intertwined with broader nationalist and racial ideologies emerging across parts of Europe. This romanticized vision of a pure, genetically homogeneous Nordic people was, at various points throughout this period, deliberately promoted and exploited for explicitly political purposes, perhaps most infamously by Nazi ideology during the 1930s and 40s, which frequently invoked supposed Viking ancestry and imagery to help support its broader racial theories regarding Northern European racial purity and superiority. This historical context matters directly to the genetic findings we've just walked through, because the actual DNA evidence tells a story that stands in direct, almost complete, contradiction to that politically motivated narrative. The real, scientifically documented Viking world was demonstrably diverse from its very foundation, shaped by centuries of migration, intermarriage, and cultural exchange, stretching across enormous distances from Greenland in the far northwest to Byzantium in the distant southeast. Actual Viking Age burial sites contain individuals of Sami ancestry, Southern European ancestry, British and Irish ancestry, and Eastern European ancestry, buried alongside individuals of Scandinavian ancestry, frequently sharing identical cultural practices, weaponry, and burial customs. The romanticized, ethnically pure Viking narrative was never accurate history to begin with. It was, quite specifically, a later political invention, one that modern genetic science now directly and thoroughly refutes. It is worth being careful and precise here, because this is exactly the kind of finding where nuance genuinely matters. The genetic research itself is politically neutral. It simply reveals what the actual ancestral patterns were, based on careful scientific analysis of preserved human remains. What this research does clearly demonstrate, however, is that later attempts throughout history to weaponize Viking imagery in service of racial or nationalist ideology were built upon a fundamentally inaccurate historical foundation, one that modern DNA evidence now firmly contradicts. Let's return to the archaeological details, because there is one more discovery from this research that genuinely surprised even the researchers directly involved in the study. Several Viking Age boat burials, elaborate graves where the deceased were laid to rest within an actual full-sized ship, along with valuable grave goods intended to accompany them into the afterlife, were found to contain individuals with no close genetic relationship to one another whatsoever. This came as a considerable surprise to researchers, many of whom had previously assumed that individuals buried together within these elaborate, clearly high-status shared graves were most likely close family members, perhaps even members of the very same immediate household. Instead, the genetic evidence suggests these boat burials frequently contained crews, individuals who very likely served, traveled, and fought together throughout their lives, bound together by shared loyalty, shared purpose, and shared experience, rather than by direct genetic kinship. This finding adds yet another important layer of nuance to our understanding of Viking Age society more broadly. Social bonds forged through shared work, shared danger, and shared purpose appear to have carried enormous weight and significance within Viking communities, quite possibly rivaling or even exceeding the importance of direct blood relation in certain specific social contexts, at least when it came to how individuals were memorialized and buried after death. If uncovering these kinds of deep, genuinely surprising threads running through ancient history fascinates you the way it fascinates me, make sure you're subscribed, because there are many more carefully researched deep dives just like this one still waiting to be explored right here on this channel. There is also considerable genetic evidence documenting the reverse pattern, cases where Scandinavian ancestry appears clearly within burial sites located far outside Scandinavia itself, in locations where local populations gradually absorb genetic contributions from Viking settlers over time, rather than the other way around. This pattern appears particularly clearly across parts of the British Isles, where centuries of well-documented Viking raiding, trading, and eventual settlement left a measurable, lasting genetic signature within local British populations, one that geneticists studying modern British ancestry can still detect and trace within the genomes of many people living across the United Kingdom today. This bidirectional pattern of genetic exchange, Scandinavian ancestry spreading outward into new territories, while non-Scandinavian ancestry simultaneously flowed inward into Scandinavia itself, powerfully reinforces the study's single most important broader conclusion. The Viking world was never a closed, isolated system. It was an extraordinarily well-connected, remarkably fluid network of trade, migration, conquest, and cultural exchange, one that stretched across an almost unimaginably vast geographic range for a society lacking any of the modern transportation or communication technology we take for granted today. Consider the sheer scale of geographic distance involved here for a moment. This was a genetic and cultural network stretching From the icy shores of Greenland in the far northwest, across the entire length of Scandinavia, throughout the British Isles, along major river systems deep into what is now Russia and Ukraine, and all the way to the ancient, sophisticated imperial capital of Constantinople in the far southeast. Achieving this level of interconnected contact and exchange, using nothing more than wind-powered longships and considerable navigational skill, represents a genuinely remarkable achievement, one that deserves recognition entirely on its own merits, without requiring any exaggerated or romanticized mythology layered artificially on top of it. So what does this ultimately mean for how we should think about Viking identity going forward? Based on the current combined weight of genetic and archaeological evidence, being a Viking during this historical period was never primarily about bloodline, ancestry, or ethnic background at all. It was fundamentally about participation in raiding, expeditions, in extensive long-distance trade networks and seasonal voyages, and in a broadly shared, remarkably adaptable culture that people from many different genetic backgrounds could join, contribute to, and ultimately help shape and define over successive generations. This more accurate, evidence-based understanding does not make the Viking Age any less remarkable or any less worth studying carefully. If anything, it makes this period of history considerably more genuinely interesting than the simplified, romanticized version most of us grew up learning. Real history rarely unfolds as neatly or as simply as popular legend eventually makes it appear. The true story of the Viking Age involved Scandinavian farmers and Sami reindeer herders, Slavic river traders and Byzantine merchants, Scottish islanders and Irish monks, Frankish nobles and Greenlandic settlers, all connected together, whether through trade, conflict, marriage, or captivity, within one single, remarkably vast, and genuinely fascinating historical network. There is something genuinely humbling about sitting with this evidence carefully. For generations, we told ourselves a simplified, tidy story about Vikings as a single, unified, genetically pure people, largely because that particular narrative was easier to teach, easier to romanticize, and, in certain darker chapters of more recent history, considerably easier to politically exploit for ends that had very little to do with genuine historical accuracy. Ancient DNA, quite literally the actual genetic material passed down directly through countless preserved generations, has now shown us that the true history was always more diverse, more interconnected, and considerably more remarkable than that simpler, more comfortable narrative ever allowed for. It reminds us that scientific consensus and popular legend do not always align neatly with one another, and that careful, patient research, whether examining ancient footprints, ancient shipwrecks, or ancient strands of preserved DNA, will continue refining our understanding of history for as long as researchers keep asking careful, honest questions, rather than settling comfortably for whichever version of the past happens to be easiest or most convenient to believe. There is also a quieter, more personal dimension to this research worth considering before we close. Millions of people today, many of them here watching this very video, have taken a consumer DNA test at some point, hoping to uncover a connection to Viking ancestry specifically. This research suggests that answer is likely more complicated and considerably more interesting than a simple yes or no. Modern genetic ancestry connected to the Viking Age rarely traces back to any single pure Scandinavian bloodline. Instead, it typically reflects this same enormous interconnected network we've spent this entire video exploring, threads of ancestry connecting Scandinavia, the British Isles, Eastern Europe, and beyond, all woven together across more than 1,000 years of migration, trade, conflict, and intermarriage. Discovering a genuine connection to the Viking Age, however small or fractional that connection ultimately turns out to be, means discovering a connection to this entire, sprawling, remarkably diverse network, rather than to any single, narrowly defined ethnic origin. Somewhere beneath the burial mounds of Scandinavia, within the shipgraves of Norway, and coiled quietly within the DNA of millions of people living across Europe and the British Isles today, lies one of the most genuinely interconnected chapters in the entire story of medieval history. Scientists were wrong about exactly who the Vikings truly were, and thanks to the patient, careful work of modern ancient DNA research, we are only now finally beginning to understand the real, far more remarkable story hiding quietly underneath the legend.